Hello and a very warm welcome. You are listening to 91.2 FM Hello Haldwani, Badalte Sheher Ki Dhadkan, and I am Niyati Rawat from the Department of Political Science. In our today's lecture, we delve into a time plagued by exploitation, inequality, and injustice. They say people who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So today, on the International Day for Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition, we must educate ourselves about the horrors of slave trade and its eventual abolition. International Day for the Remembrance of Slave Trade and its abolition is celebrated every year on the 23rd of August, which commemorates the 1791 uprising to abolish transatlantic slave trade, which began in the present-day Republic of Haiti, which was then a French colony and a center for slave trade across Europe. In this radio talk, I will be covering three segments. Firstly, about what is slave trade, then about what slavery involved, what does that practice include, and finally about how it impacted India. In the first segment, I talk about slave trade. This abominable practice operated between 15th and the late 19th century and culminatively existed for over 400 years and impacted 1.5 crore men, women, and children who were victims to slave trade. European traders and colonial powers were largely responsible to enslave people from West and Central Africa to work on plantations and in mines in the Americas. You will realize that we're using the word Americas and not America because we are talking about North America, South America, and Central America. Thus, the word Americas. Moving forward, slave trade operated in a triangular fashion, in a triangular route, where European ships transported goods such as textiles, firearms, and alcohol to Africa, and these products were then exchanged in return for slaves in Africa who were enslaved individuals. They were taken to America through the Atlantic Ocean and were sold there to work in plantations. The enslaved individuals worked in sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations in inhuman conditions, and these goods were shipped back to Europe, generating immense profits for European traders and American plantation owners, meanwhile disrupting African society. Now let's talk about slavery and what does this practice essentially involve. Firstly, the denial of autonomy. Enslaved individuals had no control over their own lives. They were dehumanized and considered property or assets rather than human beings, stripping them of their basic human rights and personal freedom. Their dehumanization meant their dignity and humanity were taken away. Slavery also involved exploitation and abuse as it comprised forced labor of individuals under harsh and violent conditions. They even faced severe punishment for resisting or trying to escape slavery. They endured physical violence and psychological abuse and exploitation with no recourse for justice. Enslaved individuals were separated from their families, causing a generational trauma and severing social and community bonds. Slavery thus was a systemic oppression, as it not only inflicted immense physical and emotional suffering on those enslaved people, but also disrupted their families, communities, perpetuating a cycle of inequality and injustice. Slavery in this way entrenched racial and social hierarchies. Now moving on to talk about the impact of slavery in India. As colonization and imperialism and white supremacy or race supremacy was at the heart of slavery, India was not untouched by this practice. However, India's history of slavery is often forgotten. Indentured labor or forced labor started in India in 1834 and lasted up to 1922. Despite having been officially banned in 1917 by British India's Imperial Legislative Council after the pressure from freedom fighters including Mahatma Gandhi. Between 1830 to 1860, during British, French and Portuguese colonization of India, they prohibited slavery by implementing several acts. So, in a way, they stopped slavery in India, but only to replace it with bonded labor or bonded servitude or indentured labor. This is the reason why we find large Indian diaspora in Caribbean, Africa, and Malaysia. The people of Indian descent continue to live in the Mauritius, Sri Lanka, and Fiji even today. So, as the history goes, the British Empire was expanding to South America, Africa, and Asia, so they needed new labor to work in the sugar and rubber plantations. But now slavery was considered evil and inhuman, so they developed a new concept of indentured or contract labor. But now slavery was abolished. However, the mindset of the plantation owners remained of slave owners. They were accustomed to forced labor and coercion and violence. That was common in slavery. Meanwhile, in India, British had destroyed traditional agricultural practices. There were frequent famines and food shortages, and thus the poor farmers were affected the most in the present day states of Jharkhand, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra Pradesh. These farmers were indentured for 10 years or more to work in British colonies in plantations. Though British called this practice an agreement or contract, but it was a new kind of slavery. The vulnerable Indians were misled about the nature of the work, the wages they would receive, and the living conditions in these places. The main ports for departure of these migrants were Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay ports. The sea journey itself was long and traumatic in crammed ships with very little space for movement, poor sanitation, little access for food and medication. The laborers also faced physical and sexual abuse in these ships as there was no way to go out of the ocean. Migrants even called this crossing the Kala Pani. Migrants took with them to these new places their culture through food, music, and language and created a unique socio cultural environment for themselves. However, they had their own set of challenges in these colonies. When they were opposed by the locals, lack of food supplies, clean water, sanitation, and no health care. These migrants even died of snake bites, hunger, diarrhea very commonly. Most of the migrants could not go back to India, their homeland, because they had nothing to go back to, as their families were destroyed and there was no contact with their remaining family members. Some migrants were not welcome home because of the untouchability associated with travel abroad. For many, their families had forgotten them, while for others, the cultural gap was so stark that they could not return. Slavery is not only a story of abuse, exploitation, but also of uprooting people from their homelands and communities, with UNESCO designating 23rd of August as the International Day for Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. We memorialize these lives, the victims of slave trade, and educate ourselves about the past in order to never repeat it again. Thank you very much.